Ethan always believed he could read the story of a machine just by looking at it, the history of every mile, every dent, every scrape. But the rusted carcass he bought for $50 looked less like a machine and more like a gravestone. It sat at the back of the junkyard like an exiled relic, half sunk into the mud, its frame warped and skeletal, the doors hanging crooked on broken hinges. The windshield was nothing but a fractured spiderweb of glass clinging to its frame, and the roof had caved in slightly, as if time itself had knelt on it. Ethan stood there for a moment after handing over the cash, staring at the thing, wondering whether he had just made the stupidest purchase of his life or stumbled onto something oddly poetic. The junkyard owner slapped the side of the car, flakes of rust raining down like brittle confetti, and laughed. "You're the only man crazy enough to take that trash off my hands. $50! I should frame this receipt." Ethan ignored the jab, already picturing the engine mount inside, one he knew would fit the old Ford truck waiting in his workshop like a patient on the operating table. He loaded the rusted shell onto the trailer with the help of a groaning winch and secured it with thick straps, brushing the dust off his palms when he finished. Atlas watched from the cab of Ethan's truck, his intelligent amber eyes tracking every movement. The 5-year-old German Shepherd always rode with an air of disciplined calm, tail relaxed, posture alert, a quiet confidence that made strangers assume he'd been through military training. Ethan opened the door, and Atlas hopped out gracefully, landing with a soft thud, nose immediately pressed to the ground as if cataloging every scent blown in by the wind. The yard smelled like corroded metal, old oil, and forgotten stories, nothing Atlas hadn't smelled before. But as Ethan guided the trailer through the gate and into his workshop yard, he noticed the shepherd's gait slow a little, his ears tilting forward in focused curiosity, his steps becoming more deliberate as they approached the rusted car. Ethan parked beside the workshop and climbed out, stretching his back, wiping the sweat and grime off his brow. Atlas sniffed around the tires of the trailer, tail wagging lazily, completely normal, until Ethan unlatched the trailer's ramp and lifted the rusted car door. It groaned open with a tortured screech, as if something inside protested being disturbed. Atlas stopped moving instantly. His tail froze mid-swing, stiff as a board. His ears shot upright, then dipped slightly, tilting not with curiosity, but with tension. His breath caught in a sharp, audible hitch. Ethan frowned, turning toward him. "Hey boy, what's up?" he asked lightly, thinking maybe Atlas had smelled a snake or a stray cat. But Atlas didn't answer in any familiar way. Instead, he stepped backward, just one step, but that single retreat from the car was so uncharacteristic that Ethan's smile slipped. Atlas never backed away from anything, not thunder, not gunshots, not the blazing flames of the workshop fire they survived 2 summers ago. But now his paws shifted on the concrete, fanning slightly as if bracing for something unseen. A deep, wounded whine, soft, fragile, almost pleading, escaped his throat. Ethan paused, hand still on the rusted door, staring into the dark interior of the car. From the outside, it looked empty, just hollowed seats and ripped upholstery. But when he leaned closer, the air that spilled out was stale in a way that made the skin on his arms rise. Old dust, old leather, and something else he couldn't name. He drew in a deeper breath, expecting maybe the sour hint of animal droppings or mold. But it wasn't that. It was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that felt lived in, fought against, suffocated inside. Atlas let out another low whine, this one trembling like a note struck from deep inside his bones. He padded forward a few steps, then stopped again, torn between instinct and terror. His eyes weren't scanning the car, they were locked on a single point inside the back seat, the shadows clinging like thick smoke. And in those eyes, Ethan saw something he had never seen on his dog before: recognition. Not fear of the unknown, recognition of something remembered. "Atlas?" Ethan whispered, crouching down. The shepherd flinched at the sound, then slowly inched toward him, pressing his head weakly against Ethan's chest. His body trembled, not violently, but with a deep, steady vibration, the kind that comes from a memory clawing its way up from the unconscious. Ethan wrapped an arm around him instinctively. He'd trained Atlas since he was a pup. He knew the dog's signals better than his own heartbeat. And this was fear rooted in something old. Something buried. Ethan ran a calming hand down Atlas's back, feeling each muscle flex and contract beneath the fur. Easy, boy, it's just a car, just a piece of junk. But Atlas didn't believe it. His gaze drifted back to the open door, to the darkness inside that seemed to breathe. His tail lowered until it brushed the ground, and his chest rose and fell with sharp, shallow breaths that sounded like sobs. Ethan had seen dogs frightened before, but this wasn't that. This was trauma surfacing, like oil rising through water. Something about this rusted wreck had reached inside Atlas and gripped a part of him Ethan didn't know existed. And for the first time that day, Ethan felt a chill. Not from the wind, from the way the shadows inside the car felt alive, watching. From the way Atlas's trembling form seemed to warn him without words. This wasn't just scrap metal he'd brought home. This car held a memory, a buried truth, and Atlas had recognized it the moment its door opened. Ethan kept one hand on Atlas's trembling side, the coarse fur rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths that didn't match anything happening in the yard around them. The sun was bright, the air warm, a soft breeze rustling through the leaves near the fence line. Nothing threatening, nothing out of place, nothing that should have triggered this reaction. Yet Atlas stared into the rusted car like he was standing at the mouth of hell itself. Ethan rose slowly, keeping a steadying hand on the dog's back, and stepped closer to the open door. A swirl of dust lifted from the seat as he leaned inside, disturbed by the shift of air. The smell was thick, stale with the scent of years passing in silence, the kind of odor that lingered in abandoned rooms where forgotten objects absorbed the sadness of their own history. He ran his fingers along what remained of the upholstery, the once gray fabric now shredded into ribbons that curled like dead leaves. Beneath it, the cushioning had long disintegrated, leaving fragments of foam clinging to the springs. Nothing unusual, scrap cars were always like this. But when he pushed the seat forward, he saw the metal frame underneath, and his breath caught. Claw marks. Not animal, not random. Long, jagged gouges etched into the steel, human-sized. 10 lines, 5 from each hand. Dragged downward with such desperate force, they deformed the metal slightly, bending it inward. Ethan reached out, fingertips tracing the grooves. The coldness of the steel seemed to vibrate against his skin. He had seen panic before, seen claw marks on doors from dogs trying to escape a burning home, but these marks were different. They were frantic, violent, terrified. Whoever made them had fought with all their strength. Behind him, Atlas shuffled back again, paws scraping softly on the concrete. When Ethan turned, the shepherd's eyes were locked on the marks, pupils wide, breath uneven. The dog whimpered, an agonized sound that twisted into a low, sorrowful moan, tail tucked, body lowered in what looked like shame. Ethan crouched, heart tightening. "What is it, Atlas?" he whispered. "What are you remembering?" The dog pressed his forehead against Ethan's knee, closing his eyes as if trying to block the memory out, or maybe trying harder to remember it. Ethan turned back to the seat and continued searching. He felt something sticky beneath the foam fragments. He scraped it with his fingernail and lifted it to the light. Duct tape. Old, yellowed, brittle, the adhesive turned to dust. Not tape used for repairs. Tape used to bind. Tape used to silence. Tape used to restrain someone who fought hard enough to leave claw marks in steel. Ethan's stomach twisted. He reached deeper, pulling up a mat of tangled fabric and scraps. Something small glinted beneath the debris. Ethan pinched it between his fingers and drew it out. A hair clip. A tiny butterfly with faded pink wings. The plastic had cracked neatly down the center, one wing chipped, the other scratched. The clip itself was bent, rusted slightly, the metal spring stiff. It must have belonged to a little girl, maybe left behind, maybe dropped, maybe torn out. "Atlas?" Ethan said softly, lifting the clip. Atlas didn't look at the object. He reacted to it. The moment Ethan held it up, Atlas's entire body jolted as if struck by an electric current. A sharp, broken bark escaped him, but it wasn't aggressive. It was horrified. Atlas stumbled backward, ears pinned flat, tail pressed tightly beneath his belly. His hind legs trembled so violently they nearly buckled. He stared at the clip the way a man stares at a ghost he spent years trying to forget. His chest heaved. He let out a whine that broke halfway through, cracking like something old and brittle snapping inside him. "Hey, hey," Ethan said, lowering the clip, stepping toward him. "Easy, easy, boy." Atlas shook his head, backing away another step, as if the tiny piece of plastic held the power to crush him. The shepherd's eyes glistened. Ethan knelt, reaching out a hand slowly. Atlas approached it after several seconds, nuzzling his hand with a trembling desperation that wasn't seeking comfort, it was confessing something. Ethan didn't know how a dog could look like it was apologizing, but that's exactly what Atlas looked like. Ethan swallowed hard, throat tight. He turned back toward the car interior and forced himself to crawl in deeper, sliding across the torn seat until his weight pressed into the springs. The interior roof lining sagged like rotting skin. The windows were filthy. Every surface felt soaked in some long-faded emotion, fear, pain, struggle. Ethan leaned into the footwell, searching with both hands now, pushing aside old wrappers, shards of cracked glass, a broken pen, a rusted coin. And then he found it. A strip of fabric caught between the rubber flooring and the metal frame. He tugged it loose and unfolded it. It was part of a child's dress. Blue, with tiny white specks. Torn violently along one edge. Dried mud caked around the hem. Ethan stared at it, the weight of dread settling into his chest like wet sand. He placed the piece gently beside him and reached farther under the seat, feeling for anything else. His fingertips brushed something sharp, metallic. Another clip? No, a button, a small white button torn from clothing. And deeper still, at the very back, something softer but rigid. He pulled it forward. A shoelace, pink, frayed where it had snapped. Atlas whimpered again, pacing in a tiny circle, nose close to the ground, movements erratic and distressed. He kept glancing between Ethan and the car, as if torn between wanting to flee and wanting to drag Ethan away from whatever horror lay buried inside the rusted frame. Ethan collected the items in a trembling hand and stepped out of the car. He knelt in front of Atlas, showing him the torn strip of dress, the button, the shoelace. Atlas collapsed onto his haunches, head lowering slowly, ears flattening, tail curling inward. His breath stuttered. The shepherd wasn't reacting like a dog identifying random scents. He was remembering something. Something he had lived through. Something tied to this car. Ethan stroked the side of Atlas's neck gently, trying to steady both of their breathing. "What happened to you?" he whispered, voice cracking. "What did you see in there?" Atlas placed one paw on Ethan's knee, a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes were wet, filled with a deep, harrowing sadness that made Ethan feel like he was staring into the past itself. The rusted car wasn't just junk. It was a grave of memories. And Atlas, somehow, some way, had been part of whatever story it once held. The trunk had always bothered Ethan from the moment he saw the car in the junkyard, a warped, dented lid caked in rust so thick it looked like it had grown scales. But now, after seeing Atlas unravel in front of him at the sight of a hair clip and torn dress fabric, that trunk felt like the final boundary between the present and a nightmare sealed shut by time. Ethan circled to the back of the car, hands trembling as he tried the latch. It didn't budge. He yanked harder. Nothing. The lock was rusted into a single mass, fused like old bone, refusing to open. Atlas stayed behind him, but not close, hovering several feet away with the posture of someone torn between duty and dread, his paws shifting restlessly. Ethan fetched his crowbar from the workshop, gripping it so tightly the metal bit into his skin. The trunk resisted for several long moments, each pole scraping rust flakes into the air like red snow. The sound was awful, a metallic shriek that grated along his spine. And then, with a final heave, the latch gave way. The trunk lid shot upward so abruptly that dust burst out in a choking cloud, the hinges screeching like something alive. Atlas's reaction was instant and devastating. The shepherd stumbled backward, ears pinned flat, tail curling under until it nearly touched his chest. A sharp, wounded cry tore from him, a sound so raw and broken it didn't resemble anything Ethan had ever heard from a dog before. It was the sound of memory resurfacing with a violence that shattered composure. The dog trembled from head to tail, his paws scraping at the ground as he fought the instinct to run. But he didn't run, he stayed. He endured it. Ethan's stomach clenched. He turned to the open trunk. Inside, what remained of a small blanket lay crumpled like a discarded piece of night sky, navy blue, dotted with faded pastel stars. Mold had devoured some edges, leaving patches stiff and brittle, but enough remained intact to see it had once been soft. Someone's favorite, someone's comfort. Ethan reached in gently, fingers brushing the fabric, and as he lifted it, dust drifted down like powder. The corner of the blanket bore something stitched in small, careful embroidery, M.I.A. The name struck him like a punch, not because he recognized it yet, but because of the way Atlas reacted. The shepherd let out another shuddering whine and lowered himself onto his belly, crawling a few inches forward before stopping again. He didn't look at Ethan. He looked at the blanket with an expression that should have been impossible for an animal to convey. It wasn't just sadness. It was mourning. It was recognition. It was guilt so deep it hollowed out his posture. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He lifted the blanket closer to the light. Amid the mold stains and torn edges, he saw faint scratches on the inner lining, tiny marks like fingernails scraping fabric over and over again. His breath hitched. Someone had clung to this blanket. Someone had used it as a shield, a comfort, a last desperate grip in a terrifying world. Ethan's vision swam for a moment as a cold realization seeped through him. He looked at Atlas, then back at the blanket. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was a clue left behind by a child who had once lived inside this car. Ethan sank onto the concrete beside the trunk, the blanket soft and impossibly heavy in his hands. He remembered the day he adopted Atlas, how the shepherd had been found wandering near a deserted highway rest stop, limping and underweight. The rescue group knew he had come from a bad situation. The rope burns around his forelegs said as much. But they had never pieced together where he came from. Dogs didn't tell stories. They only carried scars. But now Ethan wondered, what if Atlas hadn't simply escaped an abusive owner? What if he had escaped a scene of horror? What if he had witnessed something so traumatic that every rusted car, every dark interior, every faint scent trapped inside old upholstery haunted him for years? What if this car, this exact car, was part of his past? Ethan stood slowly. Atlas pushed his nose forward, toward the blanket, his body trembling but compelled. He sniffed once, then twice, deep breaths that shuddered through his ribs. And then he whined again, high, fragile, devastated. He nudged the blanket with the tip of his nose, then pulled back sharply as if the contact burned him. "Atlas," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside him. "Did you know her? Did you try to help her?" Atlas closed his eyes, pressing his head against Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped an arm around him, the dog's body quivering under his touch. It wasn't just fear, it was remembrance, a burden resurfacing. a story he had never been able to tell. The sun drifted behind a cloud, throwing the yard into a muted shadow. The air felt colder. He looked down at the blanket again, then at the open trunk. A thought tugged at the edge of his mind, unformed but heavy. Something still waited beneath the surface. He folded the blanket carefully, holding it to his side. Atlas rose, nose twitching, ears swiveling toward the far edge of the yard. Then, without warning, he began walking. Not nervously, not aimlessly, purposefully. Ethan watched him move, slow but certain, each step deliberate. The shepherd's tail remained low, but his movements were guided by something unspoken, a memory, a scent lingering in the earth, a moment frozen in time that only now, confronted with all these reminders, had thawed enough to resurface. Atlas padded past the tool shed, past the old water pump, past the boundary Ethan rarely walked behind, where the ground dipped slightly toward a patch of hardened dirt. Atlas stopped, looked back at Ethan. Then he used his paw to scratch the soil once, twice, 3 times. And Ethan understood. His heart hammered in his chest as he approached. The blanket clutched tightly in his hands. Atlas stepped aside, giving Ethan room. The shepherd bowed his head low, ears drooping with the weight of what he was revealing. Ethan knelt. His fingers brushed the dirt. Something waited beneath it. Something that had been hidden for years. Something that Atlas had carried alone, unable to show anyone until now. He dug. The earth was hard, compacted, as though untouched for a long time. Atlas paced beside him, whining softly with each handful of dirt Ethan pulled away. After a few minutes, Ethan's fingers hit something soft but rigid. His breath halted. A fabric bundle. Small. Wrapped with care, or desperation. He lifted it free. And as he unfolded the scrap of blanket around it, the terrible truth hit him with suffocating clarity. The remains inside were tiny. Human. A child. Mia. Atlas let out a long, low sound. A sound that wasn't a whine, wasn't a bark, but something ancient and grieving. A sound that spoke of a memory he had carried alone for too long. And Ethan, staring at the fragile bones cradled in the faded star-patterned fabric, understood at last. Atlas hadn't just survived something terrible. He had escaped it. But she hadn't. The morning after Ethan discovered the buried collar, Atlas stayed glued to his side like a shadow with a heartbeat. Even when Ethan tried to step away to grab his tools, the German shepherd circled back, nudging his hand as if reminding him that something was not yet finished. The collar, dirty, frayed, and cold from years underground, sat on Ethan's workbench wrapped in a cloth. He hadn't been able to throw it away. He hadn't even been able to look at it for long without feeling a strange knot tighten in his chest. Whoever Dash was, whatever had happened inside that rusted $50 car, the past wasn't done talking, and Atlas wasn't done remembering. The sky outside was overcast, thick gray clouds pressing low as if the world were holding its breath. Ethan opened the workshop door wide, letting in the faint scent of impending rain. Atlas stood at the threshold, staring out toward the car as if expecting something to appear out of thin air. Ethan crouched next to him and rested a firm hand between the dog's shoulders. "We're not done, are we?" he said quietly. Atlas answered by lowering his head and gently bumping Ethan's chest with his muzzle. Not fear this time, not panic, more like a plea. Ethan took a long breath, stood, and walked toward the rusted car again. The mud around it had dried into hard patches, but the deep impression from where Atlas had dug remained. Something pulled Ethan back to that shadowy interior like a thread pulling a needle. When he opened the driver's door, Atlas didn't retreat like the first time. He moved forward, slowly, cautiously, eyes fixed on the back seat. His body was tense, ears forward, every muscle coiled with memory and anticipation. Ethan leaned into the car, shining a flashlight across the ripped upholstery. The beam traced over broken springs, torn fabric, and rusted metal bones. But this time, something caught his eye, something he had missed before. On the back of the passenger seat, almost camouflaged by grime and age, was a streak of dried, dark brown. Old blood. A lot of it. Ethan felt his pulse stumble. He reached out and touched the stain with a gloved finger. The texture flaked under the slightest pressure. Atlas whined sharply behind him, pacing in small circles, tail stiff. Ethan followed the blood trail downward. It led to the floor under the seat, then toward the back door. More flaking stains, small but numerous, like droplets from desperation. Ethan's breath grew heavier as he opened the opposite door. And there it was, what he hadn't seen, what Atlas had sensed all along. The metal floor of the back seat had a large dent, a violent crater pushed inward from the outside, the kind made by a boot, or by someone kicking over and over again, trying to get out. Ethan ran his hand over the warped metal, cold, uneven, pain frozen in steel. He swallowed hard. Boy, they weren't just trapped, someone locked them in. Atlas's ears twitched, and he moved closer until his head rested against Ethan's arm. Ethan could feel the dog's heartbeat hammering, fast, erratic, more intense the longer they stayed near the dent. Something inside Atlas remembered this. Something inside him had lived it. Ethan backed out of the car and sat heavily on the workshop steps. The weight of everything pressed down. What the car was, what it had been used for, and what Atlas might have endured before Ethan adopted him from the rescue center 2 years ago. He'd always known Atlas had scars, not on his body, but in the way he startled at metal doors slamming or how he reacted to the smell of gasoline. The rescue paperwork had been sparse. Found wandering highway, owners unknown, severe separation distress. Ethan never pushed for more. But now he had the truth staring him in the face. Atlas wasn't afraid of the car itself. He was afraid of what happened inside it. Ethan looked back at the rusted wreck, then at the collar resting inside the workshop, then at Atlas. "You knew him, didn't you?" he whispered. Atlas slowly lowered his head, eyes clouded with something that looked like grief. Ethan stood suddenly and walked inside, returning with the cloth-wrapped collar. He knelt in front of Atlas and unwrapped it. The brass tag caught a sliver of gray light. Dash. Atlas stared at it, then pressed his forehead against Ethan's chest with a force that nearly knocked him backward. His body trembled from head to tail, not with panic this time, but with aching sorrow. Ethan held him, fingers buried in the dog's thick fur, grounding him through the storm inside his mind. Then Atlas stepped away and did something he had never done before. He walked toward the car, stopped at the open back door, and lay down in front of it. Not out of fear, not out of sadness. Like a dog keeping vigil at a grave. Ethan's throat tightened as he understood. "He didn't make it out, did he?" he murmured. Atlas let out a faint, broken whimper, the kind dogs make when a memory hurts too much to hold. Ethan looked at the dented metal, the dried blood, the abandoned collar. The whole story assembled itself in his mind like an unwanted puzzle. 2 dogs, both locked in, both terrified. One died. One clawed his way out and ran until his legs gave out, and the world forgot the car. But Atlas never did. He had carried this grief like a ghost on his back. The sky rumbled with distant thunder. Atlas rested his head on his paws, staring at the interior where his lost companion had taken his final breaths. Ethan knelt beside him and whispered, "We'll finish this. We'll find the rest of the truth. And I promise you, boy, whatever happened, whatever monster did this, I'll make sure no one forgets him again." Atlas looked up, eyes shimmering. And for the first time since the memory returned, he didn't tremble. He was ready for whatever came next. The rain started slowly, tapping the roof of the workshop like fingertips drumming on a coffin lid. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching the drops scatter across the rusted car, as if the sky itself mourned what had happened inside it. Atlas sat beside him, still and calm now, the way someone becomes calm after crying themselves empty. His eyes were fixed on the car, not with fear this time, but with a strange, heavy acceptance. He had remembered everything he had fought so hard to bury, and now he waited for Ethan to do what needed to be done. Ethan crouched beside him and placed a hand on the shepherd's neck. "All right, boy. The past has had its say. Now it's our turn." He walked to the workbench, grabbed a pair of gloves, a crowbar, and a flashlight, then returned to the car. The rain grew louder, like a slow building drum roll. Atlas followed, close at his heels. They approached the back seat again, the place where Atlas had laid in vigil only hours before. Ethan braced himself and pried open the floor panel beneath the dented metal. It creaked loudly. Rusted bolts snapped. Dust puffed out in clouds that smelled like mildew and thyme. Beneath the loose, rust-eaten sheet of metal was an empty cavity. Ethan lowered the flashlight and swept it across the space. Then he froze. Inside lay a second collar. Not rusted, not buried, not forgotten. Untouched. It was smaller than the first one, the fabric faded but intact. The brass tag glinted when the light touched it, polished by years of stillness. Ethan picked it up slowly, almost reverently. Atlas leaned in, sniffing deeply, and his ears lowered, as though the scent reached through every layer of memory he had locked away. Ethan turned the tag over. It read, "Dash, if lost, he's not alone." Ethan's breath faltered. Not alone. The words pierced deeper than he expected. Whoever owned these dogs, whoever loved them, believed they were inseparable. 2 dogs, a pair, a family. Ethan felt something tighten in his throat as he whispered, "You weren't running away that night. You were trying to get help." Atlas whimpered softly, resting his head against Ethan's knee. Ethan placed both collars side by side on the car's trunk, the names shining under the rain. Then he walked around to the driver's side and opened the glove compartment. He hadn't checked it before, it had been jammed, but now, with a firm tug, it cracked open. A soggy stack of papers spilled out, old insurance forms, receipts, scraps of gum wrappers. Most of it was ruined, ink bled into smears. But a single photograph, sealed inside a plastic sleeve, had survived. Ethan lifted it out carefully, wiping condensation from the surface. 2 children stood in front of a farm fence. 1 boy, 1 girl, both smiling with the kind of pure joy only childhood can produce. And in their arms were 2 puppies, 1 sable, 1 black and tan. Atlas's younger self stared out from the picture with wide, bright eyes. The other puppy, unmistakably Dash, rested beside him, tiny paws dangling. But the kids looked nothing like monsters. They looked kind. They looked like they loved those dogs more than anything in their world. So what happened? Why had the dogs been locked inside the car? Why had only 1 survived? Ethan's jaw tightened. The questions carved themselves deep inside him. He gathered the photograph, the collars, and the damaged papers, and carried them inside the workshop. Atlas followed, but paused to look back at the rusted car with one long, heavy gaze. A farewell or a promise, Ethan couldn't tell. Inside, Ethan spread everything out on the workbench beneath a hanging lamp. He examined the photograph again. The kids were wearing school uniforms. A badge was visible on the boy's shirt pocket. Ethan leaned closer. It wasn't a school badge. It was a shelter badge. A no-kill animal rescue symbol. Ethan blinked, confusion swirling. This wasn't adding up. He flipped one of the half-ruined papers over. A corner of ink survived, barely legible, enough to make out the words. Owner surrender form, relocation notice. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Whoever owned the dogs had surrendered them, not abandoned, not thrown away. Surrendered them under some kind of forced relocation. Eviction? Emergency move? Something serious enough they couldn't take the animals, and maybe the car had been used for transport. Maybe the children weren't even there when it happened. Maybe the tragedy wasn't malice. Maybe it was negligence, or panic, or a terrible mistake. But the result was the same. Dash died. Atlas became a ghost, carrying another dog's memory. Ethan exhaled slowly and turned toward Atlas, who lay near the door, eyes soft and tired. "You didn't lose him because someone hated you," Ethan whispered. "You lost him because someone failed him." Atlas's ears twitched, and he lifted his head, watching Ethan with a quiet understanding. Ethan walked back to the rusted car one last time. The rain had soaked it completely, water pooling in dents and crevices. The metal looked darker, older, like a tomb finally unearthed. He placed his hand on the roof and said softly, "You can rest now." Then he stepped away, returning to Atlas. "You deserve closure," Ethan said, kneeling. "Both of you." He gathered both collars, looped them gently around his wrist, and opened the workshop door. Atlas stood and followed without hesitation. Together they walked into the rain, down the dirt path that led behind Ethan's property, to the wide field where he often took Atlas running. The grass was tall, bending with the wind, shimmering under the rainfall. Ethan dug a small hole beneath the old oak tree, the place Atlas always chose to rest after long days. He placed both collars inside, side by side, then added the photograph, folding it carefully. Atlas sat beside him, silent, watching with eyes that glowed with grief and peace intertwined. Ethan covered the hole with soil, patting it gently. "He's home now," he said. Atlas lowered his head, touched the earth with his nose, and let out one long, steady exhale, the last ghost finally leaving his chest. The storm eased. The clouds parted. A quiet beam of light broke through, striking the ground where Dash now rested. Atlas looked up at Ethan, and for the first time since the nightmare memory rose to the surface, his eyes were bright again. That night, Atlas slept at Ethan's side with no trembling, no whimpering, no haunted dreams, because the past had finally been given a grave, and the future now belonged to both of them, whole, unbroken, and free. Ethan glanced out the window at the rusted $50 car sitting under the moonlight. Once a coffin, now a confession, and tomorrow he would tear it apart piece by piece, not out of anger, but to ensure no other animal ever suffered inside its steel shell again. Beside him, Atlas sighed softly in his sleep. The last sound of a heart that had finally found peace.